Client who has turned in ankles. This affects her hips as her knees cave in. She has strength in her quads, but cannot perform the hinge movement or squats properly. I'm not sure how I can help her. As we got a situation, here we go, where the foot ankle complex is more inverting, like so. And then the knee or the tibia, we have my son here, would be going the other way. The knee is going into internal rotation. This is creating a twist in the knee. So if the calcaneus in the foot is more of an inverted orientation, the tibia has to externally rotate as a consequence. But if the knee is caving in, you got a situation where I have femoral, distal femur, IR, tibial, external rotation, twist in the knees, if you please. No, I will not, because that being stuck, and you're not really stuck, but being stuck in that position and having an inability to go the other way, namely tibial IR and femoral ER, is going to create some potential problems with movements like a squat or a deadlift. Why is that? Well, I'm glad you asked. The reason why that is, folks, is because when you are in an orientation where you got tibial ER and femoral IR, that is the screw home mechanism. Meaning that the knee is going to be biased more towards extension. There's going to be a reduction of space in the knee joint, which can limit movement, namely flexion, which is the opposite, femoral ER and tibial IR. You kind of need to be able to bend your knees for something like a squat. And also, too, if you're going to be deadlifting from the ground, you need to be able to bend your knees to be able to get down to the ground. If someone can't do that, a lot of times what you'll see instead is those folks will bend mostly through the lower back. It's not necessarily the best way to pick something up off the ground because you're just not going to be utilizing your hips as effectively as you could. So that's exactly, well, I can't say exactly, but that sounds like what is going on with Renea's client, is you have a twist in the knee joint. How do you know if you got this? You might visually see it. You'll see the patella pointing forward, and you'll see the foot turning out. Knee flexion is often limited in these particular cases, so that could be also something to look at as well. What the heck do you do about it? That is the most important question for this particular case. And basically, we do the same thing that we've always done, which is if you got someone who's biased into a particular orientation and they don't have the ability to reverse that orientation, you need to find ways to be able to get them to reverse that. Think Missy Elliott, flip it and reverse it. I always wanted to be able to say the next line, but I can't because it was done in reverse. Anyways, so if you got a situation locally where I got the tibia externally rotating and the femur internally rotating, well, you got to teach the tibia to IR and the femur to ER. But folks, we can't just do something locally at the knee and hope for the best, because a lot of times that don't work. We have to look at the more proximal influences that could create the femoral internal rotation that we are seeing. And that, folks, would be an anterior orientation or tilt of the pelvis. When I anteriorly orient or tilt the pelvis, meaning that it goes into a forward position, the acetabulum is going to be facing more inward, and that's what creates an internal rotation action at the femur. And then as a consequence, what will happen is the tibia in that scenario could externally rotate to either increase balance or to drive ER because you can't create that ER at the pelvis. And so this could also contribute to difficulties with things like a squat and a hinge. If I am anteriorly tilting or orienting, in order for me to attain a fair amount of depth in the squat, aka I got to go all the way down, well, you got to be able to go the other way. So that person may be limited in their ability to squat deep. Maybe they can only get to parallel or even slightly above, because in order for me to go ATG, which is my preferred way of squatting, you got to be able to tuck the hips underneath you so you can go all the way down. With the hinge, the issue that we would likely see is they might arch their back excessively as they try to posteriorly displace their pelvis. Not going to be useful for this particular individual. So we have to make sure that they can create a posterior pelvic tilt first and foremost, so that can allow them to then restore available movement options. So a lot of your basic stacking drills that we've gone over ad nauseum. In fact, I'll link it in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/common-ankle-problems. Check it out. It'll be out on Monday, most likely. But in that, I have a thing that I will link called the Stacking Starter Pack. It's a YouTube playlist that I put together because I get people saying, "Hey, Zach, what do I do for condition X, Y, and Z?" Well, I can't do that unless I evaluate you, but we do have that on zachcouples.com, so go ahead and check that out. But if you get really good at some of these simple stacking-based moves, it's probably going to take care of a fair amount of issues, or at least is going to set up a good foundation for you to then try more complicated things. But once you have that, once you can stack like a boss, maybe you do like something in hook lying or whatever, then what you want to do is you want to work on things that will untwist the knee. So you got to create the posterior tilt, and then you have to work on things that are going to promote femoral external rotation and tibial internal rotation, and to some extent pronation through the foot. Namely, you got to be able to evert the calcaneus, which is progressively working towards internal rotation. So what I would do in the beginning is first work on getting that person to be less screwed. Namely, what I mean by that is if they're stuck more in a screw home position, tibial ER, femoral IR, you want to do things that reverse that position. High depth squats are really good for this because when you're at between 0 and 30 degrees of knee flexion, the tibia is going to be more internally rotating and the femur is going to be more externally rotating. So there's some different squat progressions you can use. If you're this particular individual who has a difficult time preventing the knees from caving in, you can put a band around the knees. Not that you're pushing knees out big time, but what you're doing in that particular situation is you're just pushing them out enough so then you fix the femurs so the pelvis can tilt posteriorly. There's a squat progression that I got that I will link in the show notes. Again, zachcouples.com/common-ankle-problems. Check it out. From there, what you want to do then is you could progress to things that work into lower ranges of hip flexion. Now, this is going to buy us some internal rotation, but what we want to teach our supreme clientele to do is instead of getting the IR by dumping the pelvis forward, we're going to get the IR more so through the femur. And this is going to be useful because if you got a person who has an inverted calcaneus or their foot is turning out, you got to teach them to evert. And the way you do that is through internal rotation of the extremity. That's going to require you to work the mid-ranges of hip flexion, namely 60 to 100 degrees of hip flexion. And the reason why that is because in that range, the femurs are going to be moving towards internal rotation. This is based off of how the angle of pull changes for your posterior rotators in the hip. Things I would do would be split squats. If you got someone who's struggle bus and they don't have a good capability of IRing, doing an ipsilateral load can be really useful. Once you've done that and you've worked depth and they're not doing any crazy compensatory things, you want to work on that last bit of internal rotation. There's a half kneeling bent over reach series that I really like for this because what you do is you put that person into an internally rotated position at the femur in the pelvis without anteriorly orienting, and then you work on untwisting the knee in this case to help influence ankle position. And then once you've done that, if you're feeling really frisky, you're like, okay, Big Z, I got this. What you got for me next? Well, don't worry. I got something for you. If you can master one of my favorite moves of all time, the bottoms up shifty split squats, which makes you the mayor of IR City. Whew, no one will mess with you. So that would be where I would progress through. As you're doing all this and you're driving movement options, folks, do not forget that you probably need to work on squatting and you probably need to work on hinging. But I would choose variations where your supreme clientele can perform those movements without having the knees cave in as much. So that could be a Zercher squat, because that's going to allow you to create some posterior expansion. Could be a kettlebell or a goblet squat where you got a low position through the arms, meaning that you're going to be at 0 to 60 degrees of shoulder flexion. That could also work quite well. In terms of your deadlifts, you might start with some RDLs that actually bias a little bit of flexion through the spine. One of my favorite starting positions to get people deadlifting would be a snatch grip RDL. And if you do it in an offset position, that will allow some rotation to occur in the pelvis, which can make it easier for your peeps to go tuck themselves. And that would be how I would approach this. You got to untwist the knee, but you got to make sure that you get the posterior tilt, aka the stack, first. Once you got that, you're going to unhinge the knee, working on femoral ER and tibial IR. And then if you progress internal rotation-based activities like a split squat, no one will mess with you.